Hello, everyone. Is God necessary for moral facts to exist? Or can uh, atheists account for the reality of uh, objective um, duties and objective values? So I've got a special guest with me today. I will allow him to introduce himself in just a moment. Uh, this is Crash Course Apologetics. I'm Jordan Hampton. Uh, I aim to summarize the work of Christian scholars in animated videos and interviews. Um, Today, you'll get to listen in as my guest and I discuss Dr. Erik Wielenberg's metaethical model. And if you enjoy this interview, um, make sure you click the like button. Please consider subscribing and turn on the little bell so that you'll be notified when I have other interviews as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. So I will pull up my interview scene here. And my guest is Adam Johnson. I about said Dr. Adam Johnson, but it's not yet, right? Not yet, Doctor.
Close.
Yeah.
We're about 2 months away.
Okay, so if you don't mind, just go ahead and tell the audience a little bit of your background, what got you interested in moral philosophy.
For sure. So yeah, I started working on my PhD in philosophy almost 7 years ago now. It's hard to believe. I've been on the slow boat, but when I started my PhD in philosophy, I was very interested right from the beginning in moral philosophy. And honestly, it was because I had studied a lot of, apologetics even before I began my PhD. But to me, the moral argument for God was the least compelling argument for me. I know for a lot of people that's not the case, but I always felt the teleological and the cosmological argument for God to be much more compelling and convincing. And so I actually began in moral philosophy because I saw the moral argument for God to be one of the weaker arguments. And I thought, well, maybe if I worked in that field, I could figure out ways to strengthen it. And over the last 7 years, I've come to appreciate the argument a lot more, and I've done my best in trying to strengthen it, make it better.
Awesome. So what got me interested to begin with was I told you that I'd interviewed David Baggett, and he is, I think, a very well-known Christian scholar working in this area on the moral argument. And after that interview, I told him that I would be interested in interviewing someone specifically on Erik Wielenberg's metaethical model. And
Okay.
he suggested that I reach out to you because you had written on the topic. And I actually, when I first searched for your name, uh, I think I was either led to your website or Ratio Christi's page, and it said there that you were working on a book with Dr. William Lane Craig. Can you tell me about that book? I can't seem to find much more info about it right now.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. I will say that if anybody does try to search for my work or does a Google search for me, to use my middle name, because there's a lot of Adam Johnsons out there. So my middle name is Lloyd. Just think of, the Jim Carrey movie Dumb and Dumber, and think of Lloyd, and that's my middle name, Dumb and Dumber. So Adam Lloyd Johnson is what I'd recommend doing a search. But yeah, the book I'm super excited about because over the last 5 or 6 years, as I've been working on my PhD dissertation, it's mostly focused on Erik Wielenberg's model. And so I've gotten to know him. Super great guy, super nice. And I would consider him, a friend at this point. We talk a lot and have met a lot one-on-one. And what came about is I was able to coordinate a public debate between him and William Lane Craig. We had this a couple years ago now at NC State University. 1,200 people were there. It's on YouTube. And from that debate, I was the moderator. From that debate, we're putting it into a book, a debate book that's being published by Routledge. It'll be out this summer.
Great.
And we invited 5 other philosophers, including David Baggett, to write responding chapters to it. So that's kind of how I got to know him. But I'm the editor of the book, and then I author the first chapter, just introduction to this issue. But it's a debate. The majority of the book is a debate between Craig and Wielenberg. So that's the book that I'm working on with Craig.
I love that debate. I've listened to it multiple times at this point. It was I think because it was written beforehand, it is much more in depth than most debates are. I prefer written debates, and that made that debate stand out among some of other Craig's debates. So I'm really looking forward to that book. Should be out this summer then.
Yeah, and that's what made it so easy to publish, because it was all written out ahead of time. And then what will be added, though, in the book is all of their footnotes. So their footnotes, as you can imagine, with 2 scholars at that level, their footnotes are almost as substantial as the actual text that they read in the debate. And they didn't read their footnotes.
Of course,
so
yeah.
The people who get the book will benefit from all those footnotes as well.
Great. All right. Well, let's talk about the paper that you've written. Now, when I checked, I think you've published 2 with Philosophia Christi, critiquing things that Erik Wielenberg has written on. One of them was the paper you sent me. I didn't find the other one till last night, but I'm just going mainly off of that paper that you sent me. The title of it is Debunking Nontheistic Moral Realism, and the subtitle, I don't have it in front of me. I think it's something like a critique of Erik, or I can't remember the exact. It's about the lucky coincidence objection to Erik Wielenberg's model. So that's what I want to discuss with you today. But before we unpack the paper, let's just define some of our terms. So you talk about moral realism in the title. So what do we mean by moral realism?
Yeah, moral realism is a specific position within metaethics. And metaethics, for those that aren't familiar, is just the study of kind of where morality comes from, or what is morality. We're used to dealing with ethics, is abortion right or wrong? Is the death penalty right or wrong? That's the field of ethics. Well, metaethics is a little bit deeper, if you want to think about it, because metaethics, we're asking, where does morality come from, or does morality even really exist? So within metaethics, moral realism is a position that just says moral truth is real. There are objective moral truths, and that would be opposed to all the other metaethical positions. That would be non-realist positions, who would say, no, there isn't any such thing as objective moral truth. It's all subjective or relative. And I'm oversimplifying it, but there's a whole host of metaethical positions. Some are realist and some are non-realist.
Perfect. And for those that are interested in this a little bit more, I interviewed Dr. Terence Cuneo, and in that interview, he took a good amount of time to kind of give us an overview of the field of metaethics, what some of the options are. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested in looking at some of the other positions than what we'll discuss today, maybe check out that interview with Dr. Terence Cuneo that I did. So, Adam, something that comes up repeatedly throughout the paper is the topic of moral knowledge. So we talked about what moral realism is. What is moral knowledge?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like it sounds. It's just that, so if we're talking within the camp of moral realism, right? So at least for this conversation, we're dismissing all the other positions and just having a conversation among moral realists. And as you can imagine, within moral realists, there are differences of opinions as to how could it be that morality is real. So all moral realists believe that morality is real. They just disagree as to how it's real or where it comes from. So then moral knowledge would simply be, our understanding of that objective moral truth. So our moral knowledge would be like, our scientific knowledge or our philosophical knowledge. It would be, true beliefs that we would have about this objective moral truth that moral realist claim is out there, so to speak, or objectively real.
Yes. So these facts, it's not enough just to have the facts exist. We have to be aware of the facts, and we have to be justified in thinking the facts are there. And so moral knowledge is wrapped up in our justification for our knowledge of the facts, or believing the facts to exist, right?
And that's why this discussion involves both ontology, whether moral truth exists or not, and epistemology. So they're two separate issues within this conversation. Moral knowledge being, look, even if these truths do exist, how do we go about knowing them, or where do we get knowledge about them from? So it's not only an ontological discussion, there's also epistemological issues too.
Perfect. Okay, so this may be an easy answer, and we'll unpack both of these questions as we go. So, does one have to be a theist to have moral knowledge?
No, and I don't know anybody who would hold that position. I think pretty much everybody across the board agrees that theists and atheists alike can both have moral knowledge. And I'm a Christian, I'm an evangelical Christian. And so my understanding would be from, for example, Romans 2, where Paul explains how everybody has God's law, or moral truths, so to speak, written on their hearts. So, Paul's not talking in fancy philosophical language, but he's just explaining how people, even without the Bible or without any direct revelation from God, know right from wrong because of what's written on their heart. And I think this fits in really well with moral intuitionism. So you've got folks like Robert Audi and others, well-known philosophers, who talk a lot about moral intuitionism, and that seems to fit together very nicely with Romans 2.
And Michael Huemer, correct? He wrote a book called Ethical Intuitionism.
Exactly right. Yeah.
I'm reading that now. So, okay, and I think you'd give a similar answer to this question, but I'm just asking it to represent both the epistemology and ontology that we're talking about. So you said yes. Non-theists can have moral knowledge, and you would say similarly, non-theists can be moral realists.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's a position among non-theists or atheists that is definitely making a comeback. So, if you go back 30, 40 years, maybe not even that far, the big fight was over moral realism versus moral non-realism, and especially at the popular level. But what's happening, especially at the academic level in the last 10, 20 years, is that more and more academic philosophers, atheist, non-theist philosophers, are coming out in favor of absolute objective morality, like Wielenberg, like Huemer, like David Enoch. And some people are even saying this is now the majority position among professional academic philosophers, which is encouraging, yes. Right? On one hand, but when they present their models of objective absolute morality, they're claiming that can exist even though there is no God. And that's where I am trying to push back on them and saying that God is a much better explanation for objective morality than any of these non-theistic models. So I can say, let me answer your question this way. Yes, there are many non-theists out there who believe in objective morality. I just don't think that they have a good explanation for it.
Or as good an explanation as theism.
There you go.
Yeah. I want to be as charitable as we can be.
For sure.
Maybe it's a great explanation. But if there's a better one, we should prefer it. And
I would say the exact same thing. And that's why work has been over the last 5 or 6 years is evaluating, in particular, Wielenberg's model, and there's others, but I've focused in on his, and then I compare and contrast that to a model that I've developed for objective morality, and it's based on the Trinity. So I call it a Trinitarian metaethical theory, TMT. And it's not quite natural law, it's not quite divine command theory. It's something new, I think, that I've developed.
Well, that really interests me. So I don't know how much you will bring those concepts into today's discussion, but if you ever want to do another interview with me and we just talk about that, I would love it.
Yeah.
Originally, that's what David Baggett mentioned. He said that you had this Trinitarian meta-ethic, and as soon as you said it, there were some things that had previously clicked in my head about how the Trinity could be could fit nicely in this discussion. And when he said that, I was like, wow, there's somebody that's already thinking like this and developed it. So I want to discuss that with you sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right, so we're talking specifically about Erik Wielenberg's model, because his model is going to differ than maybe a Russ Schaefer Landau's model, who is also, I think, an atheist, but also a moral realist. Correct? So just by critiquing Wielenberg's model, it's not the case that we've dismissed other atheistic moral realist positions.
No, there's commonalities, of course, and similarities, but just like among Christians or theists, we have differences and we disagree over certain things. So that's the case as well within this camp of atheists who affirm objective morality. They have differences and disagreements among themselves.
Gotcha. All right. Well, then let's specifically unpack what Erik Wielenberg's view is. So can you, to the best of your ability, summarize this model, this metaethical model that he has?
Yeah, and I think the best resource for folks, if they want to dive into it, is his book, one of his books, just called Robust Ethics. And this came out, I want to say 2013, 2014, right when I started my PhD, published with Oxford University Press. It's less than 200 pages, but it is fairly technical philosophy. And in that it's the best book that he's written in terms of really explaining and unwrapping his model. And I think for folks that are new to it, the best way to get their minds around it is that it's Platonic, and he uses that term sometimes. It's Platonic in the sense that he's positing that there are these brute ethical facts, that there are these just brute truths of morality that just exist out there, and that's why it's similar to Plato's model. If you're familiar, where Plato posited that there were these forms out there, these universals, whatever you want to call them, that were just there. They didn't come from anywhere. They're eternal. They've always existed. And so Wielenberg picks up on that. And he's not, obviously new, goes all the way back to Plato, but there were some other big names, especially in the 20th century, that were positing similar things, that there are these brute ethical facts out there, moral facts in this case, kind of like numbers. A lot of people would have a Platonic understanding of numbers, that the number 2 just exists out there in a sense, right? Not as a physical concrete object, but as a more of an abstract object. So Wielenberg would just say the same thing about moral truths, that they exist out there. And so that would be the first big part of his model. And then the second part of his model would be the making relationship, or what he proposed is this making relationship, that there are non-moral properties, let's say our cognitive faculties or the situations we find ourselves in, that instantiate these moral properties. So it's those two things which are really the two main parts of his model: the brute ethical facts, those abstract objects, if you want to call them that. Sometimes he does use that terminology. and then this making relationship, how these become instantiated.
Can you explain what he means by the third factor
Yeah,
approach?
and that might be helpful later in our conversation to think through why he's trying to use this third factor.
Yes.
So maybe let's talk about the lucky coincidence objection and stuff like that, because I think it'll make a lot more sense to your viewers if we understand those things first, and then we'll understand why he's bringing in this third factor idea.
Okay. Well, let's do that then. So, on our little list of questions, the next one that I had for you was explain how his model is left ungrounded, but the theistic model is not. Do you want to go there first, or you don't? Do you want to talk about the lucky
Yeah.
coincidence? Okay.
No, we'll do that real quick, and then we can move on to so there's, like, in my dissertation, which the things that I've gotten published they've mostly had to do with the epistemological issues. So that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. But before we get there, the other major critique, and this is what William Lane Craig brought up a lot in the debate, another major critique of Wielenberg's, or critique of his model, is more ontological. And it's just, what Platonic models have always been accused of is just, where do these things come from, or how can these things exist out there on their own? So when you talk about grounded, or when I talk about something that's grounded or ungrounded, Wielenberg is positing, similarly to Plato, that these things are just out there. These moral truths are just out there. They just exist. And so they're ungrounded in that sense. They don't come from anywhere. There's nothing backing them up. They're just there on their own. And what a lot of people who have critiqued Platonic models throughout history, including William Lane Craig at the debate, is, well, ontologically, it doesn't seem like those are the type of things that we should expect could exist on their own. They seem to be things that cry out for explanation. They seem to be things that aren't a good ontological stopping point. In other words, there seems like there are things that need to be grounded in something. They need to come from somewhere or something or someone. And that's why, a lot of Platonic models throughout history have paired well, according to a lot of people, with Christianity, because they say, even Augustine, right, that what Plato was actually describing was the mind and nature of God, and that God is a better stopping point or a better explanation, even for these abstract objects, or whatever you want to call them, that they come from somewhere. They come from this deity that is eternal and without origin, right? So we as theists have said throughout history that God is a better ontological stopping point than these brute ethical facts. So that's where the conversation goes in terms of, is it legitimate to posit these groundless brute ethical facts, or is it more plausible that there's an explanation, something that grounds them, something that grounds these moral truths? So that's the grounding issue in this conversation.
Got it. Okay, so you argue in this paper, and again, for those that are interested, Adam Johnson's paper is linked in the description of this video, so you can click on that link and find it pretty easily. You may have to either contact him or do interlibrary loan to get the paper, but I'm sure he'd be happy to share it with you if they emailed you, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so you can click on that link and get his email pretty quickly and easily if you want to read it. So in the paper, you argued that Erik Wielenberg's metaethical model is susceptible to what you call the lucky coincidence objection. So what do you mean by that term, and how is it a serious objection to his model?
Yeah, and this goes more towards the area of epistemology or moral knowledge. It has ontological implications as well, as will probably come up in this conversation. But I think the heart of this objection is much more epistemological. So it kind of goes like this, just to make it really simple. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that there is moral truth out there. There is objective moral truth. So we're going to grant that for the sake of argument. And the question becomes then, how do we get this knowledge of it? If it is out there, if it does exist, how do we know about it? And one of the reasons why this becomes a problem for people like Wielenberg and most people who have a Platonic model in that sense is that one of the key hallmarks of abstract objects, of these brute ethical facts, one of the hallmarks of them is that they're non-causal entities. So if these brute ethical facts, if these truths do exist out there, they're non-causal. They don't cause anything. They can't, in other words, they can't cause us to have knowledge of them. So the question becomes, well, then if they're non-causal and they just out there, how do we get knowledge of them? And this isn't a new problem for Wielenberg. I mean, this goes back to probably Plato himself, or any Platonic models throughout history, and Plato had his own explanation of how we have knowledge of these universals, or his forms, the Platonic forms. So Wielenberg runs into the same issue of having difficulty explaining, and that's in a nutshell, I try to summarize it as just a lucky coincidence. And I'm not the only one. Wielenberg uses that term as well. He understands the problem. He understands the issue. And so if the book that I pointed out that he wrote, he uses that same phrase, the lucky coincidence objection. It's not new to me. So what it is, okay, we've got these truths out there for the sake of argument. Let's say that they're out there. And we also have moral beliefs, and it would sure seem to be a very lucky coincidence if our moral beliefs happen to align with that moral truth that's out there. So we've got these two things. We've got the moral truth that's out there. We've got our moral beliefs. But why think that those things are the same? Why think that our moral beliefs are correct, that they line up with this moral truth? If this moral truth is out there and it's non-causal, first of all, what causes our knowledge, and why think that it lines up? And to, posit that it does match up, well, that seems to be a very lucky coincidence. If you think about all the possible moral beliefs that we could have, and if moral truth is fixed out there, it seems to be a very lucky coincidence that we would just happen to believe what is correct according to this objective moral truth. That's the lucky coincidence objection.
Is this a good time for me to share the evolutionary debunking argument to show the luckiness, like what makes it seem unlikely? When we say lucky, we mean unlikely.
Well, and an evolutionary debunking argument just amplifies the problem. So the problem exists without EDAs, without evolution. Like I said, this problem goes all the way back to Plato. However, over the last 200 years with the theory of evolution, it amplifies the problem, which sounds like you're about to explain.
Well, you're going to explain. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put up the slide that I sent you that just lays out the set of premises that you offered in the paper.
That'll be helpful.
Okay, so you won't be able to see it. If you want, I can read the premise and then you can explain it. Do you have that argument in front of you?
Yep, I can pull it up. It won't mess with the camera or anything.
No, it won't mess with anything. Okay, so I have the evolutionary debunking argument. I didn't know whether to call it for moral knowledge or against moral knowledge. I don't know how you would phrase it. It seems like the thing you're debunking is moral knowledge. So anyway, you can go ahead and read out the premises there and then unpack them.
Okay. And I will say before I start reading them that this is based on Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. So Alvin Plantinga is a very famous Christian philosopher, and he developed a very, very well-known argument. And I basically used that argument. I started with it as a base and just applied it to moral knowledge. So, in fact, if I remember right, these first three premises come straight from Plantinga, and then I just add on a couple more premises to specify it to moral knowledge.
Yes, correct. All right, so I've got it pulled up now, and you can go ahead and explain it.
Okay. So the first premise, the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable given naturalism and evolution is low. So this premise would take a little bit of unpacking, but if anybody's familiar with Plantinga's argument here, they'll be familiar with this. But basically all it's saying is that, look, if naturalism, and by here we could just simplify it and just say atheism, naturalism being the idea that there is no God, nature is all that exists. I'm oversimplifying things, but just for this to get through this. So if there is no God and evolution is true, then our cognitive faculties were developed through a haphazard evolutionary process. And this is a very well-known problem. This goes all the way back to Darwin. Darwin himself, it's called Darwin's doubt. And there's some famous quotes from Darwin himself. When he started to become convinced of his own evolutionary theory, he began to realize that, look, if this evolutionary process, which is based on random changes and nature selecting what's useful for survival and reproduction, nature selected, if you will, things that would help us survive and reproduce, not necessarily to know what is true. And so Darwin has these famous quotes where he would say, if we develop from these lower life forms, can we even really trust our minds? And there's some famous quotes where he says, we're unable to even trust our cognitive faculties, I'm paraphrasing, because of the evolutionary process.
Yeah, something about would anyone trust the convictions of the minds of the lower apes, and you give an analogy in your paper to your. I think it was in your paper. Yeah, I listened to another interview of yours as well, but about your cat and the vacuum cleaner, and I thought that was a helpful little illustration. Maybe you want to offer it.
For sure. I mean, it's like, so my cats are very scared of the vacuum cleaner, and I would imagine, they have all sorts of false beliefs about the vacuum cleaner. I don't know what they are, of course, but however, those false beliefs are things that have helped felines to survive. So, and that's the whole point of this argument, is that evolution selected for things that would help us survive and reproduce, not to know necessarily truth. And so, like with cats, they have false beliefs, but those false beliefs help them survive, and so nature selects not necessarily for true beliefs, but just for beliefs that would help us survive and reproduce. And that becomes the problem then, and with Plantinga's argument, he explains how this is the case for all of our beliefs and our cognitive faculties, is we can't really trust them to be reliable because they were developed in this evolutionary way, if you believe evolution is true.
Mm-hmm. And evolution would select for behavior, not beliefs. The beliefs are more a secondary a byproduct almost, and what's mainly selected for is getting bodies to do certain things in certain ways in order to perpetuate their genes.
Exactly. That's a safe way to say it.
Okay, well, that's premise one, the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable given naturalism and evolution is low. So walk us through these next steps.
And I will say that premise one goes all the way back to Darwin, and a lot of thinkers throughout history in the last 200 years have recognized the problem there. So this isn't unique to me. This isn't unique even to Plantinga. So premise 2. So if someone believes, so this argument isn't saying that naturalism or evolution is necessarily true. It's just saying that if somebody believes both of those things, believes that there is no God and believes, macroevolution, and they understand premise 1, they see that the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable, given no God and given evolution, is low, then they have a defeater for their belief that our cognitive faculties are reliable. So in a sense, premise 2 is just pulling out the points that are latent within premise 1.
Good. I can't remember if you really said anything more about premise 2 in your paper. You laid out some of the defenses that Plantinga gives for premise 1, but I think from there it just kind of unpacks itself.
I think you're right. Yeah, premise 3 then, if someone has a defeater for their reliability of their cognitive faculties, then they have a defeater for any belief produced by their cognitive faculties. And this is what's so, I think, great about Plantinga's argument, is he's showing, look, this is something that would apply or be a potential defeater to all of our beliefs. Because what happens is a lot of non-theists will use these sort of arguments to, let's say, dismiss our religious beliefs, or they will dismiss moral beliefs. So they'll tell evolutionary stories about how, evolution produced our religious beliefs or evolution produced our moral beliefs, and then they'll reject those and say, see, evolution caused us to think that there is a God, or evolution caused us to think that morality is real and objective. But those beliefs are false. However, then they'll stop and kind of put up an arbitrary wall and not allow that argument to attack our other beliefs. But what's, I think, great about Plantinga's argument is he said, look, you can't do that. If this argument works with our moral beliefs and our religious beliefs, then all of our beliefs are defeated in that sense.
Very good. Okay, so that's premise 3. And then 4 and 5, you apply it specifically to moral knowledge.
Yeah, and this is where I'm just taking his argument and I'm applying it to this conversation with Wielenberg, saying that, Plantinga's argument is for all of our beliefs, and I'm just pointing out that our moral beliefs are included in that. So that's what I'm specifically discussing here, is our moral beliefs. So my conclusion then, premise 5, is just that if somebody believes that there is no God and they affirm, a contemporary evolutionary theory, then they have a defeater for their belief that their moral beliefs are reliable. So, as I said before, this just amplifies the epistemological problem. The problem exists even if even before the theory of evolution came about in the 1800s. The lucky coincidence objection goes all the way back to Plato, to his original Platonic theory, but it's this theory of evolution which really amplifies the problem for non-theists.
And I think that this is a useful point, or something to keep in mind, that it's not just Christians that use this evolutionary debunking argument. There are atheists as well that think that this argument is successful, and so they think moral beliefs are false. So who would be some examples of those kinds of ethicists that would approve of the evolutionary debunking argument?
Yeah, so Michael Roos is the first name that comes to mind, and he's an atheist philosopher, and he would be one who rejects that there is objective moral truth. And he would definitely affirm this evolutionary debunking argument. So he would say, the best explanation for our moral beliefs is that they were developed through this haphazard process of evolution, nature selecting people who had certain beliefs that caused them to work together, because a group that works together well is going to outwit and outplay and outlast a group that doesn't work together well, like the show Survivor tells us. So he would just say, the evolutionary pressure or natural selection selected people who had the moral beliefs that we do because it helped them survive and reproduce better. So he would say that explains our moral beliefs. You don't need to posit anything objectively true out there. Our moral beliefs just came from this evolutionary process. So, yeah, like I said, a lot of atheists or non-theists would use this to dismiss our moral beliefs as true and also our religious beliefs as true. And that's one thing I pointed out that I find an inconsistency in Wielenberg, because he uses a very similar argument to this in another book of his to dismiss some of our religious beliefs. And that's one of the reasons why I like Plantinga's argument, is because it points out, hey, you can't do that. If you're going to use this argument to discount certain of our beliefs, then it applies to all of them.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So you mentioned Joshua Green, Peter Singer, Sharon Street. She has an excellent quote that if you don't bring it up, I'll bring it up. And Richard Joyce. So those are just some examples of non-theists who use the evolutionary debunking argument. They think it's successful against moral beliefs or moral knowledge.
Exactly right. So yeah, this isn't just coming from Christians. It's interesting because Wielenberg has to fight on two fronts, right? He has to argue against his fellow atheists who don't believe in objective, absolute morality. And then he has to fight Christians who do believe in objective, absolute morality, but just say that God is a better explanation for those things than his model. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, sometimes he finds himself in a tough spot. He's got enemies on both sides.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about this. So how does Erik Wielenberg try to overcome this evolutionary debunking argument?
Yeah, and his book, and I do recommend it. I think it's important that folks are aware of models like his out there. So I believe there's 4 chapters, and the whole last chapter of his book is attempting to deal with this issue. And so he brings up Sharon Street, he brings up some other well-known evolutionary debunking arguments, not Plantinga's, but others, and then tries to show, or tries to use his model to show how it doesn't defeat his model. And so he recognizes that his position has this problem, and he's trying to find ways to respond to it. And in my dissertation, I lay out 4 ways that he tries to respond to the lucky coincidence objection, and then I do my best to show that all 4 of his attempts fail. So I believe, if I remember right, the paper you're referring to in Philosophia Christi, I don't think I cover all 4 of them, so I can quickly try to cover all 4 of them if you'd like.
Yeah. So I want this to be a broader summary than just the paper, but the paper gave me a starting point. So yeah, okay. Highlight the 4.
Well, as I see it, the first way that he attempts to deflect the lucky coincidence objection is that he actually wrote a paper specifically in response to Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. So this was before his book. It might have been even 12, 15 years ago now. But he wrote a paper, and it was published going after Plantinga's argument. And so that's how I see him first trying to respond to the evolutionary debunking arguments, going after Plantinga's argument. And I just don't think it's successful. So one of the ways that he tries to defeat Plantinga's argument is he says, look at the evidence. I mean, it seems that our cognitive faculties are very reliable. And he gives examples of that, and he says, even though Plantinga's argument concludes that they're not reliable, if evolution and naturalism were correct, however, when we look at the evidence, we see that our cognitive faculties are very reliable. And you know where I'm going with this, and a lot of people have pointed this out already, that's very circular, because he's using to evaluate the accuracy of his cognitive faculties, what is he using? He's using his cognitive faculties. And so he's using the very thing that's under question. He's using the very thing that is potentially defeated, or that we're wondering if they're reliable or not, in order to prove their reliability. And so that fails. And then his other strategy in that paper is to say, look, we don't know all that much about the evolutionary process. So he kind of tries to posit some doubt, or that we really don't know as much about the evolutionary process as we think we do. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. But he tries to kind of poke holes in the theory itself and say, we know so little about the evolutionary process, and we don't know exactly how it created our cognitive faculties, so we shouldn't put much stake into letting it cause us to doubt our cognitive faculties. And that really doesn't defeat the argument, because the argument only applies to somebody if they believe in contemporary evolutionary theory. I mean, the very first premise says that if naturalism and evolution is true, then so on and so forth. So, of course, if somebody rejects evolution, then that particular argument doesn't apply to him. So I don't know if it's such a great point of his to do that, because then, of course, the argument doesn't apply to the person. But besides that, maybe there are some atheists that reject evolution or have a lot of doubts about evolution, but I don't find that to be the case. The majority of non-Christians or non-theists that I talk to seem very confident.
Sure. Yeah.
Evolution is true and their understanding of it. So it doesn't seem to work as a good response to me.
Gotcha. So was that was the first that you're talking about, that paper that he published, and you said there were 4.
Yeah, that's just the first. So let me see if I want to go, what order I want to go in here. Let me deal with this one as the second one, because I think we can get through it pretty quickly. So one thing he does, and this is in his book Robust Ethics, in the last chapter, he posits the idea. He says, look, there is contingency here, and what I mean by that is that there's contingent factors at play in our evolutionary process. And maybe we could have come up with different moral beliefs if evolution took a different path and all that stuff. So he acknowledges that it's a problem. But then he says, well, kind of speculatively, he says, what if the laws of nature were necessary? And even the evolutionary path that led to human beings was necessary in some sense. In other words, it wasn't contingent and haphazard as much as we think it is, that it was more necessary, and that the evolutionary process almost had to create us the way that we are. And so the moral beliefs that we've developed through that process aren't lucky or contingent or haphazard. It was more of a necessary process.
Yes.
So this is his way, as you can imagine, to kind of try to get rid of any luck out of his model. Because if there, and as he admits, if you have any contingency, if things could have gone another route, then there's luck involved. But if we get rid of the contingency, then we get rid of the luck.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's saying, look, maybe there wasn't any contingency, and the laws of nature maybe are metaphysically necessary, and even the evolutionary path that resulted in us was somehow necessary. And I just find this to be incredibly speculative. There is discussion, obviously, in the philosophical world about the laws of nature, whether they're necessary or not. As Wielenberg admits, it's very difficult to try to prove. I mean, you can speculate that the laws of nature are metaphysically necessary, but it seems like a very difficult thing to try to prove.
Mm-hmm.
But even more so when you start speculating about how the evolutionary path, in some sense, was necessary. To me, that if you take evolution, and again, I'm not saying that I agree with everything in contemporary evolutionary theory, but if you just take it as its face value, the proponents of it say that it was completely haphazard, and not only could it have resulted or gone down various paths, in fact, it did go down different paths. And that's, this path created human beings, this path created canines, this path created honeybees. Mm-hmm. And so not only can we imagine that there were various paths it could have taken, if contemporary evolutionary theory is true, it in fact did take those different paths. Mm-hmm. To say that it was metaphysically necessary that it had to produce beings like us seems to fly in the face of evolutionary belief, theory.
Yeah. I don't want to distract too much. Tell me your thoughts about this. So you mentioned honeybees. So the forces that, if he's right about the laws of nature being necessary, the forces that, or the evolutionary forces that led to honeybees, shaped them in such a way that, like Darwin said, they think it their sacred duty to, the worker bees think it their sacred duty to kill the ones that become fertile, or something along those lines. You can be more specific about that if you want, but the forces at work, or the eusocial norms, because bees are eusocial insects, the eusocial norms that they follow are very different than the ones that we follow. And yet those norms, if Wielenberg's right about the laws of nature being necessary, those would be necessary, those norms. And so it almost puts their norms on an equal footing as our norms, both shaped by the evolutionary process, both necessary. And so who's to say that one's better than the other? I don't know. You can tell me your thoughts about that.
And you quoted him very well. But Darwin's point was, look, if our evolutionary path would have followed more closely the path that honeybees took, then we would have moral beliefs supposedly like they do, or we would have moral practices or moral thoughts similar to bees, and like you said, killing one another and all that stuff in Darwin's quote. But just to point out that even going back to Darwin himself, he recognized that our path could have gone all sorts of different directions, and that then we would have had different resulting moral beliefs. And that just highlights, the lucky coincidence objection that, wow, aren't we very lucky that our evolutionary path supposedly led us to true moral beliefs, that they are moral beliefs that developed in this crazy, haphazard, lucky way, got us to match up with these supposed moral truths that Wielenberg and others claim is out there. That's how evolution really amplifies this lucky coincidence objection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so his second route to try and overcome was to say that the laws of nature are necessary. That's difficult in and of itself, to make that kind of argument. Not to say that there's not discussion about it, but it's a difficult thing to show. So what's the third and fourth way, if you can sketch those briefly, that he tries to overcome this objection?
Yeah, and probably his most innovative way is what you mentioned earlier, is his third factor model. So, and this isn't completely original to him. I believe Humer, who you mentioned earlier, had a third factor model, but Wielenberg's is a little bit different. So it is innovative, it is unique, and he's gotten a lot of press for it. A lot of folks are impressed, at least, with his attempt here. And I still think it fails, but his third factor model, if you will, is, I'll try to summarize it very quickly. So he says, look, if there is a third factor that, let me work it backwards. If these moral beliefs, these objective moral truths that exist out there, and our moral beliefs both stem from a third factor, then it would make sense that these two would match up.
Or they would track. I think they call it tracking. Like they would track together. They would go together, right?
Yep. It would make sense that they would line up or track or correlate, however you want to say it. It would make sense that these two, it wouldn't be as much of a lucky coincidence that these two match up or track if they were both caused by this third factor.
Yes.
So that's why you got, one thing, two thing, and then he's positing this third thing out there. And in his model, at least, his third factor model, he posits that our cognitive faculties are that third factor. So in other words, our cognitive faculties, they instantiate, and this is the making relationship I talked about earlier, our cognitive faculties instantiate moral truths, and they also lead us to have the moral beliefs that we have. So we've got two things, and they both, in different ways, stem from this third factor. They both stem from our cognitive faculties. And since they both stem, or come from, if you will, this third factor, then it makes sense that they would correlate. It makes sense that they would match up or track better. And so he posits then this relationship from the cognitive faculties to the objective moral facts, and then a different relationship from the cognitive faculties to our moral beliefs.
So what's the difficulties with this third factor approach that you see? Do you see any problems with it?
Yeah, and twofold, I guess you could say. So this relationship that our cognitive faculties instantiate objective moral truth, you can attack that, if you will, or point out the problems with his making relationship. And Craig did this fairly well in the debate, and saying that, we're positing some causal relationships here that are completely unheard of. I think at one point Craig called it voodoo metaphysics. But this making relationship that Wielenberg is positing is quite it's ontologically superfluous. It's quite. He's positing these relationships or these causal factors that we have no proof of, or we have no good reasons to believe. It seems kind of ad hoc that he's throwing them out there. And so you can attack on ontological level this making relationship. However, in my dissertation, which hopefully will get published someday, I try to point out that yes, that is a problem, but probably the bigger problem is that there's still contingency here. And so remember, if there's contingency, there's luck. So even if, let's say, we grant him the first relationship, that our cognitive faculties instantiate moral truth, he claims that's a necessary relationship. There's no explanation for it, but it's necessary. Let's grant him that for the sake of argument. However, there's still contingency in this relationship. That is, there's contingency in our cognitive faculties leading to the moral beliefs that we have. And this goes back to the evolutionary debunking arguments and how, there's all sorts of different ways that our cognitive faculties could cause us to have different moral beliefs. So because there's still contingency in the second aspect of his third factor model, he fails in eliminating the lucky coincidence objection because there's still contingency there. And as he says in his book, where there's contingency, there's luck.
Yeah. So can you, maybe I didn't catch or you're about to explain, how is there still contingency in that model?
Yeah. So the second part of his third factor model, the first part is cognitive faculties instantiate these moral truths. That's, according to him, necessary. The second part is that our cognitive faculties cause us or lead us to have the moral beliefs that we do. And that, again, just goes right back to the whole evolutionary debunking argument that we can imagine, let's say, beings, and we don't even have to imagine because there are human beings like this. So what he's trying to do in the second part is say, look, if beings like us exist, they have the cognitive faculties like we do, then they're automatically going to have the moral beliefs that we do. And I'm just pointing out that that's not the case, necessarily the case at all. We could imagine, and like I said, we don't even have to imagine because there are human beings like this who have the same cognitive faculties we do, but they don't believe in moral rights or moral truths like we do. And so there's not a necessary, like there is with here, according to him, there's not a necessary relationship here.
I see.
You can have moral cognitive faculties like us and not have the same moral beliefs. And so there's, again, you've got contingency there, therefore you've still got luck there.
I gotcha. Okay. So the third factor approach was a third way that he tries to overcome the lucky coincidence objection, but you said there was a fourth. So just to kind of summarize, the first was to go after planning his. Let me pull my scene in here so people can see me. Sorry. The first was to go after planning his evolutionary argument against naturalism. The second way that he tried to do it was to argue that the laws of nature could be necessary, and so there would be a tracking relationship. Or I'm sorry, that's the third. There would be it would be necessary what we believe because the laws of nature that shaped us would produce those beliefs necessarily. The third way was this third factor approach, where our cognitive faculties both instantiate moral truths and they produce in us the correct moral beliefs so that the moral truths and the moral beliefs track with one another. Now, what's the fourth way that he tries to overcome the lucky coincidence objection?
Yeah, the fourth way is kind of a turning of the tables, if you will. And he does this a lot throughout his book. And if you watched the debate, you saw this between him and William Lane Craig, where he turns the table on his opponent, in this case, Christianity or theism, and tries to say, look, your model has a very similar problem, if not the exact same problem. So he tries to kind of do a tit for tat type thing where he says, look, you're pointing out a problem in my model. I admit that it is a problem. I've got some responses to it. But hey, not so fast. Your Christian model or theistic model also has this problem. So your model isn't superior than mine because they both have this problem. And so he does that with this issue, and in the book tries to make the argument that one of the most popular theistic metaethical models also faces a lucky coincidence objection. And he uses Robert Adams, who William Lane Craig leans on a lot for his understanding. Robert Adams is a very, very famous Christian philosopher, has been for decades. And his book, Finite and Infinite Goods, is a classic in this area, which Wielenberg has a lot of respect for. He says that in his book. Robert Adams is not somebody to dismiss lightly, respected internationally as a great philosopher. But anyway, Wielenberg tries to point out within Robert Adams' model, metaethical model, which is kind of a divine command theory, that there are lucky coincidences even within his model as well. So that's why I say it's kind of a turning of the tables.
And that particular point where he turns the tables like this, you unpack it in the paper that you shared with me. So maybe explain how he's turning the tables and then what you did in the paper to respond to Wielenberg's point here.
Yeah, so when I wrote that paper, I hadn't really developed my Trinitarian metaethical model or theory at that point. So I was just defending Robert Adams' theory. So I'll do that first, and then maybe I'll bring in my theory as well. But the first thing I tried to do, and that's what you read in my paper, is just defend Robert Adams' theory. against his attack. So Wielenberg is arguing that there are some lucky coincidences within Robert Adams' model. And I try to argue in the paper you read that no, Wielenberg misunderstood Adams' model, and it really doesn't have those lucky coincidences like he thought it did. So I'm defending Robert Adams. So let me try to see if I can summarize this very quickly and easily. So one thing that Wielenberg claims is that nearly all, if not all, theistic metaethical models also have to posit these brute ethical facts. So this is another way he turns the table. Quite often he did it in the debate with Craig, especially during the Q&A time. And he says, look, you Christians or you theists, you're attacking my model for having these brute ethical facts, where in fact your models have brute ethical facts as well. And then he tries to point out in Robert Adams or Craig's model or whoever that there are brute ethical facts that aren't grounded in God. And so in his book, Robust Ethics, when he does this last attempt to deflect the lucky coincidence objection, he says, look, within Robert Adams' model, there seems to be these brute ethical facts that just exist out there. They're not grounded in God. They just exist out there. And then you have God and his moral nature, or however you want to call it. And boy, isn't it a lucky coincidence that those two things happen to line up? In other words, God's moral nature and these brute ethical facts that are out there that he claims are in, Adam's model. Isn't it a lucky coincidence that those two things match up? And so in the paper that you read that I wrote, I'm defending Robert Adams' model and just saying, look, no, Robert Adams is not positing brute ethical facts that just exist out there on their own with no foundation. And I give multiple quotes from Adams' model, his book, Finite and Infinite Goods, which shows that Adams is claiming that these moral truths that are actually grounded in God. And therefore there is no lucky coincidence objection here because these moral truths are actually grounded in God's nature.
So just as an example that I remember from your paper, Wielenberg says one of these brute ethical facts in Adam's model is the better the character of the person giving the command, the more reason we have to obey the command. And Wielenberg says that's just a brute ethical fact that Adams has in his model that isn't grounded in God in any way. But in your paper, you respond by, if I remember correctly, and you're probably about to say this, pointing out that in that section of the book where Adam says that the better the character of the commander, the more reason we have to obey the command, Adams is only explaining his divine command theory. But in the chapter immediately preceding this, he expands on his view of the good. And this is important because Adams takes that, what Wielenberg's calling a brute ethical fact, and Adams grounds it in his theory of the good, which for Adams, the good is God. Is that, no, did I capture that correctly?
You understand it very well. No, that's exactly right. So I'm just trying to point out in my paper that in the section where Wielenberg is quoting Adams, he's talking about, as you said, more his theory about moral obligation. And let me just step back and just take less than 2 minutes to explain Adams' model. So Adams' model has two parts. There's the first part, which is his theory of moral value, which you explained very well, that basically moral value is just anything that resembles God. So God is the good. God is the ultimate standard and the ultimate source and foundation for goodness, moral goodness in this context. And so anything that resembles God in a morally pertinent way would therefore be morally good. So when we resemble God, when we love our neighbor, that is good because it resembles God. And in that sense, Adam grounds all moral truths in God's moral nature, if you will. And then his second part is his theory of moral obligation. So moral obligation has to do with more about our duties, our moral duties, and why we should do moral things. Why should we love our neighbor? Yes, loving our neighbor is a moral good. It's morally valuable, but why should we do it? Mm-hmm. And that has to do with our duties. And that's where Adams is a divine command theorist. So like Craig, he would say that our obligations come from God's commands. And don't misunderstand. A lot of people, when they hear that, they think, commands are just like the Ten Commandments, direct verbal instruction from God. And no, what divine command theorists mean by command is any way that God makes us aware of our moral duties. So even back to like a Romans 2 type thing, or our moral intuition would also be considered divine commands. It's any way, verbal, direct, indirect, nonverbal, any way that God makes us aware of our moral duties would be considered commands in this context.
Let me say one thing and then you can continue. This will be brief. I actually did an interview with Dr. Matthew Flanagan on the topic of divine command theory.
Good.
He went through, I think it was either 10 or 11 objections to divine command theory, one of which was Erik Wielenberg's objection to divine command theory. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about divine command theory, then check out my interview with Dr. Matthew Flanagan. Okay, you can continue.
Well, and I might just piggyback on that and say, so within Christianity, there's differences. All Christians agree that morality ultimately comes from God. But within Christianity, there's disagreements as to how God is the source and foundation of morality. And the big major positions, there's more, but the two big major positions are natural law theorists and divine command theorists. And for centuries, those two have, gone at it and butt heads and disagree. And that's when I really got into studying both of them. And I would respectfully disagree with a lot of issues from both of those models. Mm-hmm. And that's why I developed my own, I guess.
Well, that's why I want to interview you on that particular topic. Yeah, because I don't know where I come down on either side. I would like to interview Stephen Evans, because he, if I've understood correctly, he has a model where moral obligations are have their origin in God's commands, but unlike Adams, he does not. He has a more natural law perspective on the good. And so Evans is almost a hybrid from what I understand, where it's like obligations are, he adopts a divine command theory model, but for the nature of the good, he adopts more of a natural law model. So I'd be interested to interview him, but I don't know anything about your Trinitarian metaethical model, so I want to learn about it.
Well, and it's not like I deny everything in divine command theory. I do pull a lot from those theories, and I don't deny everything in natural law theory either. I pull a lot from both of those historic models, and virtue theory, I guess you could say, is maybe a third one. But the big thing that I disagree with both of them is that even in the names, divine command theory seems to imply by the names that morality's, the most important thing is God's commands. And in natural law theory, just by the name, it seems to imply that the most important thing is our nature, human nature. And so the reason I named mine the way that I did is the Trinitarian metaethical theory, as I think the most important or foundational thing from which all morality flows is the Trinity, not commands or human nature, but what's deeper or more foundational is the personal loving relationships between the members of the Trinity.
Okay, well, you were so we laid out Wielenberg's 4 points and gave a response to each. Did you have anything else you were going to say about that fourth point?
No, I guess I would say in the paper that Philosophia Christi published of mine that you read, I'm defending Adams' model, but then in my dissertation, I do that as well. but then I also bring my model in, my Trinitarian metaethical model, to show how it can even answer Wielenberg in a greater way.
Well, I may just leave my audience in suspense if you'll agree to come back on sometime and lay out this model. I guess we're getting close to the end of time, so we're at 1 hour and 15 minutes. So I want to try and wrap this up within about 5 minutes. I'll go ahead and say, if you're watching live, go ahead and type your answer or your questions in the live chat, and I will choose them to ask to Adam here. Okay, well, as we finish up, did you have any other critiques of Wielenberg's model besides just kind of pressing him on this lucky coincidence objection? Because that's really been the thrust is, hey, you've got to deal with this lucky coincidence objection. And his responses to it, the 4 of them you think they aren't very effective at answering the objection. But you probably have other ones as well. Did you want to say anything about those or save those for next time?
Yeah, I mean, the other biggest objection that not only me but many other people have made against Wielenberg's model is just the ontological objections. And we talked a little bit about these before, but just that it seems like his model is very ontologically bloated. I think that was a phrase that J.P. Moreland used. But it just seems like he's positing all these ontological things that just exist out there. And for a lot of atheists, especially those who are reductive materialists, he's positing things that would just make them very uncomfortable. And this is why I said he's kind of fighting on 2 fronts here, because reductive materialists are more comfortable saying, look, all that exists is the physical universe. There's nothing that exists beyond the physical universe. And so for him to posit these Platonic abstract objects that are just floating around out there, it makes a lot of atheists uncomfortable. And so it's, even within the atheist community, it's considered a fairly bloated model, almost akin to theism, because we're positing that there's a personal being outside the universe, right? Wielenberg is positing that there's these brute ethical facts or abstract objects outside the physical universe, so to speak. And so a lot of atheists who are materialists are uncomfortable with both of those options. And so, theists can just point that out and say, based on his worldview or based on his ontological metaphysics, he's positing some things that are pretty far out there.
All right. Well, I haven't gotten... I've only got one question in the live chat, and I think this is from Joshua Johnson, and he's picking up on the point where Erik Wielenberg argued that if the laws of nature were necessary, then we would have these beliefs and so forth. So Joshua Johnson says, even if it was necessary, even if the laws were necessary, does that still leave the problem of how a non-causal entity dictated the course of evolution?
Yeah, I think I see what he's getting at. And so Wielenberg is not saying that these brute ethical facts had anything to do with the laws of nature or our evolutionary process. Wielenberg is not positing that relationship. He's saying that there may be, again, he's speculating, but there may be these laws of the universe, these physical laws of the universe, and those things might be necessary, and even the evolutionary process might be necessary. It's not that these moral truths cause the process, so he's not making that relationship. I think that might be what Josh was doing by mistake.
Okay, all right. Well, since that was the only question that we have, I will wrap it up there. Before we go, I know you said you've got, I guess your defense you've already turned in your dissertation and you have to give a defense, or you're going to be turning in your dissertation?
Nope, I turned it in February, and I'm going to defend it on April 13th. David Baggett, Greg Welty, and Ross Inman are on my dissertation committee, so I'll have to defend it to them in April, and if that goes well, I'll graduate in May, and then, the attempt will be, obviously, to get the dissertation published, and I've been talking to a few people, including Dr. Baggett, about helping me, find a publisher, so excited to go down that route.
Well, please, if you're interested, send it to me sometime, and I would love to read it. This is the moral arguments. There's more than one. Are very, very interesting to me. I think they're very powerful. It struck me when you said it, at first, and maybe that's a question I'll ask you now, after doing your PhD on this topic. Where would you put the moral argument now? Do you think it's still not very persuasive, or what would you say?
Yeah, it's hard. Some of this is subjective, right? And different people find different arguments more compelling than others. I mean, there's one sense where you can evaluate an argument very objectively and see if there's any logical errors and all that stuff. However, just dependent on somebody's background knowledge or maybe personal composure, they might find different arguments more compelling than others. And so, as I mentioned, I've always found, me personally, this isn't the case for everybody, because I know, like for you and many others, the moral argument is the most compelling argument for God. I've always found myself personally the teleological and the cosmological argument more compelling. And I probably still do find those arguments more compelling, but I have definitely over the last 6-7 years increased my respect and appreciation for the moral argument. I still don't think it's as compelling as the other two, but I don't find it to be, I don't have as many negative thoughts about it as I used to.
I see. Interesting. I don't know where I rank it, actually, but I do think that at the very least, it is a rich argument.
Yes.
And it leads to it touches on many areas in philosophy, and I really appreciate that aspect of it. But I do think that it has an advantage over the others in that, and this is probably the simplest way I can put it, it's something that is more in here, and the other two are something kind of out there. And I like the more in here stuff, if that makes sense.
No, that's exactly right. And so when I say background information, people's differences, even our culture, right? So we're in more of a postmodern culture right now where we put more trust on what's in here than what we do out there, right? And so I think, especially right now in history, the moral argument is the most compelling argument for the vast majority of people, because we're taught in our postmodern culture to follow your heart, to trust your feelings. That's what Obi-Wan, right? I mean, that's just what we're taught in our culture, to trust what's in here. And that's what the moral argument does. It begins with things in here, where the other ones are more objective, if you want to put it. It starts with more scientific, and maybe I'm less postmodern and more modern in my thinking, and that's why I find the other ones more compelling. I just have a tendency, and maybe it's because of my background information and my history, my life history, I don't trust what's in here. I don't trust my subjective feelings and intuitions very much, and maybe that's what used to give me a bad taste about the moral argument.
All right, well, if you will just hang around for like 2 minutes, maybe we can. I had a private question I was going to ask you, and then we might be able to set something up for the future. We'll just see. So just hang around if you don't mind for like 2 minutes. To everyone else that stuck with us, thank you. And please, 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 the way that you can help support my channel is very, very simple and completely free. If you will just like this video and click the subscribe button and turn on the little bell next to it, then it really will help my channel grow and reach a wider audience. And like I said, it's a way that's advantageous to you. I will have on many more guests, some other interviews that are coming up. I'm going to be interviewing Erik Sampson, who's at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, on the topic of moral nihilism. He will be critiquing the argument from moral disagreement and the argument from queerness. That's coming up in about 2 weeks. I'm also going to be interviewing Dr. Faith Paul on animal suffering, the problem that of animal pain and how we can account for that, and also Dr. Andrew Moon on the topic of Reformed epistemology. So several interviews coming up very soon. Please consider liking and subscribing and turning on the little bell. Thank you for sticking with me, and we will see you next time.